Please, my husband. Our daughter is very sick. She needs blood to survive. Please help.
Listen, woman, stop disturbing me. In fact, let me block your number.
Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment.
Please subscribe to our channel.
Yes, please subscribe. We would really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Natalie Denver grew up in a modest but meticulously kept home in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb where routine was treated like religion and promises were currency. Her mother, Marilyn Denver, worked as a senior administrative coordinator at a public high school and believed that stability was the highest form of love a person could offer. Natalie's father, before leaving when she was 12, had been a restless entrepreneur who chased ideas faster than he honored commitments, and his absence carved a silent vow into Natalie's young heart: she would never build a life that felt uncertain or fragile. As a child, she arranged her schoolbooks by subject and color, kept journals detailing her dreams of becoming a community development consultant, and volunteered at local shelters not for recognition but because she loved solving problems quietly. Even her hobbies, organizing neighborhood fundraisers, tutoring struggling classmates, learning budgeting skills from her mother, revealed a girl who found beauty in order. She was not loud, not flashy, but deeply intentional. By the time she entered college, studying urban planning and non-profit management, she had developed an almost intuitive ability to see cracks in systems and mend them before they widened. People trusted her without knowing why. Friends like Janelle Brooks admired her grounded nature, often joking that Natalie was the human version of a steady heartbeat. Yet beneath her calm exterior lived a romantic who believed in partnership built on loyalty and shared growth. She wanted a love that was dependable, not dramatic. A life that expanded gently, not explosively. She did not crave applause. She craved peace. Steve Stoner Cage's childhood unfolded in contrast, in a bustling New Jersey household where appearances were armor and achievement was oxygen. His mother, Patricia Stoner Cage, carried herself like a woman constantly auditioning for admiration, hosting elaborate dinner parties and reminding her sons that perception shaped destiny. His father, a mid-level corporate executive perpetually dissatisfied with his own ranking, measured success in promotions and applause. Steve learned early that praise arrived when he performed well, whether it was winning debate competitions or charming guests with witty stories. He became skilled at reading rooms, adjusting his tone, curating his personality like a brand. His younger brother, Ethan Stoner Cage, was quieter and often skeptical of the performance, but Steve thrived on it. In high school, he dated the most visible girls, not necessarily the most compatible ones, because visibility validated him. In college, majoring in business communications, he mastered the art of influence, understanding that charisma could open doors that competence alone might not. Steve did not consciously believe he was superficial. He believed he was strategic. He dreamed of rising quickly in corporate spaces, earning recognition that would silence any lingering doubt planted by his father's constant comparison to more successful men. Even his hobbies, public speaking clubs, networking events, social media presence building, fed his appetite for applause. Where Natalie sought stability, Steve sought spotlight. Neither was wrong. They were simply shaped by different hungers. At this early stage of their lives, their paths had not yet crossed, but the blueprint of their future tension was already written in invisible ink. Natalie, who equated love with consistency and quiet strength, would naturally gravitate toward someone who appeared confident and ambitious, believing she could help anchor him. Steve, who equated love with admiration and affirmation, would gravitate toward someone who reflected stability and offered unwavering support. The mismatch was not explosive. It was subtle, almost poetic. Both carried unspoken wounds, Natalie from abandonment, Steve from conditional validation, and both believed adulthood would heal what childhood complicated. The world around them continued spinning in separate orbits, Natalie building spreadsheets for a community housing project internship, Steve rehearsing a keynote speech for a regional business conference. Neither knew that their collision would not begin with fireworks, but with an argument about something ordinary. Neither understood that the traits they admired in each other would later become fault lines. And yet, at this beginning, there was no villain, no betrayal, no emergency hospital corridors. There was only a woman who loved order and a man who loved applause, walking steadily toward a future neither could predict. Steve Stonecage's hunger for recognition did not appear overnight. It was cultivated slowly, like a vine trained to climb whatever wall would support it. As a boy, he watched his father return home from work with tight shoulders and sharper words, measuring the day's worth by titles earned and respect received. Patricia Stonecage compensated by polishing their family image until it gleamed. She enrolled Steve in speech competitions, encouraged tailored suits before he turned 16, and reminded him that the world rewarded those who commanded attention. Ethan, his younger brother, often resisted the performance, preferring books and quiet reflection, but Steve embraced it. He discovered that applause felt like security, that praise dulled the anxiety of not being enough. When teachers admired him, he felt anchored. When classmates followed his lead, he felt powerful. Yet beneath the polished confidence lived a boy terrified of fading into mediocrity, determined never to be overlooked in a room again. By the time Steve reached university, majoring in corporate strategy and communications, he had sharpened charm into a professional tool. He could mirror personalities effortlessly, laughing at the right volume, offering insights with calculated humility. He dated often but rarely deeply, choosing partners who enhanced his social standing rather than challenged his thinking. It was during this period that Dr. Hayden Cross, a longtime family friend and respected psychologist, began mentoring him informally. Dr. Cross admired Steve's ambition but warned him gently during quiet dinners that validation was a dangerous fuel source. "If applause is your oxygen," he once said calmly, "you will suffocate when the room goes silent." Steve nodded respectfully but dismissed the caution internally. Silence was not something he planned to experience. His internships were impressive, his networking relentless, and his social media presence curated like a highlight reel of success. He convinced himself that he was building confidence, not dependency. When Steve secured his first corporate position at a mid-sized consultancy firm, he treated it like a stage debut rather than an entry-level job. He volunteered for presentations, stayed late not only to complete work, but to be seen completing work, and cultivated alliances with senior executives who admired his polished demeanor. Yet behind closed doors, there were moments of quiet restlessness. Promotions were slow, praise inconsistent, and the corporate ladder steeper than anticipated. Ethan noticed the subtle frustration during family dinners, the way Steve's jaw tightened when conversation shifted away from his achievements. Dr. Cross's earlier warning lingered like background noise, but Steve drowned it out with ambition. He believed success would stabilize everything, his confidence, his relationships, his identity. What he did not yet understand was that building a life around admiration required constant performance, and constant performance leaves little room for vulnerability. And vulnerability was something Steve had never truly learned to practice. Natalie and Steve did not meet under romantic lighting or cinematic music. Their first collision happened at a community redevelopment conference in downtown Philadelphia, where Natalie was presenting a small-scale neighborhood revitalization proposal and Steve was representing his consultancy firm as a junior corporate liaison. Natalie had stayed up the night before perfecting her slides, determined to argue that sustainable housing required long-term planning rather than flashy investment. Steve, seated near the front, listened with interest but interrupted during the candor, challenging her funding model with a confident smile. The room turned toward Natalie, waiting to see if she would fold. She didn't. Calmly, she countered his critique with data and composure, dismantling his argument without raising her voice. Steve felt something unfamiliar then, not embarrassment, but intrigue. She wasn't intimidated. She was steady. After the session, he approached her, expecting resistance, but instead found thoughtful conversation. She saw potential in his sharp mind. He saw something grounding in her calm conviction. Their early interactions were not immediately romantic but intellectually electric. They met again over coffee at a neutral cafe near the conference center, both claiming it was to continue discussing urban planning, though neither denied curiosity. Natalie spoke about her childhood vow to build stability in broken systems, sharing stories about helping her mother reorganize school programs and volunteering for housing advocacy. Steve listened carefully, genuinely impressed by her passion and discipline. When he spoke about his corporate aspirations, he framed them as tools for influence and impact, carefully presenting ambition as responsibility. Natalie admired his confidence. She had always been drawn to people who dared greatly. Steve admired her steadiness. It made him feel balanced. Yet even in those early days, subtle red flags flickered. He checked his phone often, responding quickly to messages from colleagues. He steered conversations toward long-term recognition and growth, rarely dwelling on emotional nuance. Natalie noticed but interpreted it as drive, not warning. Their first official date was both charming and revealing. Steve chose an upscale rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline, wanting to impress, and he did. The evening air was warm, and conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared dreams. Natalie spoke about wanting a home filled with books and structure, a place where children would feel safe and heard. Steve spoke about building a name that would carry weight in boardrooms, about never settling for smallness. They kissed at the end of the night under soft streetlights, a spark undeniable and thrilling. Yet beneath the chemistry lived contrast. Natalie's love language was consistency. Steve's was admiration. Neither saw it as a problem. They saw only compatibility, ambition, and promise. And so the woman who loved order and the man who loved applause began weaving their lives together, unaware that sparks can warm or burn depending on how they are tended. Tamara Jonas was raised in a world where vulnerability was treated as weakness and victory was the only acceptable outcome. Growing up in Manhattan under the sharp supervision of her single mother, Veronica Jonas, a high-profile real estate broker, Tamara learned early that life was competitive and admiration was survival. Veronica never allowed her daughter to feel small. Instead, she trained her to anticipate advantage. Tamara excelled academically, not because she loved books, but because she loved winning. She joined debate teams, modeled briefly in college, and cultivated a social circle built on influence and opportunity. Her father had left when she was 8, disappearing into another family without explanation, and the silence hardened her. She told herself she would never be abandoned, never be second choice. If she wanted something, she would claim it decisively. She was intelligent, strategic, and stunningly self-assured. Underneath the polished exterior, however, was a fear of invisibility she refused to acknowledge. She did not chase love. She chased dominance in relationships, believing that control guaranteed security. Professionally, Tamara worked as a luxury brand strategist, consulting for high-end hospitality groups and elite clientele. Her reputation was built on transformation. She could repackage struggling businesses into aspirational icons. She thrived in rooms filled with ambition and power, navigating conversations with effortless confidence. Past relationships had ended not because she lacked emotion, but because she demanded primacy. One former partner accused her of treating affection like negotiation. She dismissed him as weak. In truth, she had once loved deeply during her early 20s, but that relationship ended when she discovered she was being deceived, and humiliation etched itself into her memory. Since then, she vowed never to be blindsided again. She studied men the way she studied brands, assessing strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. She valued ambition and admired visibility. When she heard of Steve Stonecage through overlapping corporate circles, she registered his name without immediate interest, simply cataloging him as another ambitious figure climbing toward recognition. At this stage, Tamara's life had not yet intersected meaningfully with Steve's, but the groundwork for eventual collision was forming quietly. She attended the same executive networking functions where he sometimes presented, though they had not spoken beyond brief acknowledgements. She observed his confidence from across rooms, noting the way people gravitated toward him when he spoke. He represented a familiar pattern, driven, charismatic, hungry for approval. She did not pursue him. She simply recognized the type. Tamara prided herself on patience. She believed timing was everything. Meanwhile, her own personal ambitions were expanding. She wanted partnership in her firm, a penthouse overlooking the Hudson, influence that extended beyond branding into decision-making power. She did not imagine herself as someone's mistress or secret. She imagined herself as central, always central. And so, as Natalie and Steve continued deepening their relationship, Tamara Jonas lived her life independently, unaware that soon her belief in always winning would be tested in ways she never anticipated. The months leading to Natalie and Steve's wedding were filled with layered excitement and subtle tension that only careful observers could detect. Natalie approached the planning process the way she approached everything in life, with spreadsheets, timelines, and heartfelt intention. She wanted the ceremony to feel intimate and meaningful, not extravagant. Her mother, Marilyn Denver, supported her with steady guidance, reminding her that marriage was about partnership, not performance. Janelle Brooks threw herself into helping organize details, from floral arrangements to seating charts, infusing laughter into long evenings of preparation. On the other side, Patricia Stoner-Cage insisted on elegance and spectacle, urging Steve to invite influential colleagues and expand the guest list beyond comfort. Steve found himself torn between Natalie's preference for sincerity and his mother's push for prestige. He compromised outwardly, reassuring Natalie while quietly accommodating his mother's vision. The venue, a restored historic estate outside the city, sparkled with understated beauty, but beneath the polished surfaces lived differing philosophies of what marriage meant. Family dynamics simmered gently beneath the celebration. Ethan Stoner-Cage watched his older brother carefully, sensing the performance even in rehearsal dinners. He admired Natalie's warmth and authenticity, often engaging her in thoughtful conversation about her urban development projects and dreams of future community initiatives. Patricia, meanwhile, observed Natalie with polite approval but occasional critique, subtly suggesting wardrobe adjustments or guest list expansions. Marilyn Denver maintained grace, refusing to compete, though she noticed Steve's frequent phone glances during planning sessions. Small disagreements arose, about honeymoon destinations, about whether Steve should delay a work presentation the week before the wedding, but they were smoothed over quickly, often by Natalie, who preferred harmony to confrontation. The wedding day itself unfolded beautifully. Sunlight filtered through tall windows as vows were exchanged, Steve speaking passionately about ambition and shared futures, Natalie speaking softly about trust and stability. Guests applauded. Cameras flashed. The image was flawless. Yet even on that radiant afternoon, there were quiet omens. During the reception, Steve gravitated naturally toward a cluster of corporate guests, animated and energized, leaving Natalie momentarily alone at their sweetheart table until Janelle nudged him back gently. Natalie laughed it off, attributing it to excitement, but Ethan's eyes lingered thoughtfully on his brother's behavior. Later, during their first dance, Steve whispered promises about building an empire together, about rising higher than either could alone. Natalie believed him. She believed in teamwork, in growth, and shared dreams. The celebration ended with fireworks lighting the sky, guests declaring it one of the most beautiful weddings they had attended. From the outside, it was perfection, love, ambition, unity. Inside the marriage, however, the early seeds of imbalance remained, small but real. Neither bride nor groom acknowledged them fully, convinced that devotion would smooth over any difference. And so they began their married life under applause, unaware that applause fades, but character remains. The first year of marriage unfolded with cautious optimism, a blend of busy schedules and shared dinners that felt grounding after long workdays. Natalie continued building her career in community development consulting, balancing site visits with policy research, while Steve climbed steadily within his consultancy firm. When Natalie discovered she was pregnant, the news arrived on a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight filtering through their kitchen window as she stared at the test with trembling hands. Steve's reaction was immediate and emotional. He lifted her off the ground in a burst of excitement, already speaking about schools, futures, and legacy. For a time, ambition softened into anticipation. Natalie approached pregnancy with her usual methodical devotion, reading parenting books, adjusting budgets, and planning a nursery in calming shades of pale green and ivory. Steve, initially attentive, attended doctor appointments with enthusiasm, posting subtle celebratory updates that framed him as a soon-to-be father stepping confidently into a new chapter. Their home, once simply structured, began to feel alive with possibility. Pregnancy transformed Natalie in ways deeper than she expected. She felt both fragile and powerful, her body shifting as if teaching her patience in real time. Marilyn visited often, sharing practical wisdom and emotional reassurance, reminding her daughter that motherhood demanded resilience as much as love. Janelle helped assemble furniture for the nursery, laughing as they debated stroller brands and wall decor. Steve, however, began displaying subtle signs of discomfort as Natalie's world centered increasingly around prenatal appointments and baby planning. He never said he felt displaced, but his late nights at work became more frequent, framed as necessary preparation for providing stability. Natalie noticed but chose generosity over suspicion, believing stress accompanied responsibility. When Susie was born on a crisp autumn evening, her first cry pierced the hospital room with raw clarity. Steve wept openly, holding his daughter as if she were a miracle that validated his adulthood. Natalie watched them together and felt certain they had built something unbreakable. As weeks turned into months, Susie revealed herself as a bright and observant child, unusually alert and quick to smile. She gripped Steve's finger with determined strength, gazed at Natalie with wide curiosity, and developed a habit of humming softly before falling asleep. Natalie adjusted to sleepless nights with disciplined grace, organizing feeding schedules and documenting milestones in carefully kept journals. Steve adored his daughter, proudly showing her photos to colleagues and friends, yet a quiet shift emerged. Attention once directed toward him was now divided. When visitors came, their focus rested on Susie's charm rather than Steve's stories. He masked his subtle restlessness with humor, insisting he didn't mind sharing the spotlight. But occasionally, he lingered longer at networking events, returning home energized by recognition. Natalie, immersed in motherhood, believed love would naturally reel in any imbalance. She did not yet understand that identity, once rooted in applause, does not surrender easily to shared light. 2 years after Susie's birth, Steve received the promotion he had been chasing since his first day at the firm. The announcement came during a quarterly leadership meeting, where Morgan Vale, a sharp executive with a reputation for rewarding visible ambition, publicly commended Steve's strategic charisma and persuasive execution. The applause in that boardroom echoed louder than any nursery lullaby ever had. That evening, Steve returned home carrying an expensive bottle of champagne and a glow that felt electric. Natalie was genuinely proud of him. She had watched the late nights and the relentless presentations. She organized a small celebratory dinner with Janelle and Ethan, filling their dining table with warmth and congratulations. For a moment, everything felt aligned: career success, family stability, shared dreams. Steve spoke passionately about expanded responsibilities, international clients, and the possibility of traveling more frequently for high-profile contracts. Natalie listened with supportive eyes, believing opportunity was simply another chapter in their evolving partnership. But with promotion came exposure to a different world, one driven by image and constant visibility. Steve's calendar filled rapidly: networking galas, leadership retreats, executive mixers that extended late into the night. Morgan Vale became both mentor and subtle pressure point, encouraging Steve to cultivate a presence that commanded attention beyond competence. The corporate circle valued boldness, curated appearance, and social positioning. Steve adapted easily, refining his wardrobe, upgrading his car, and rehearsing speeches even at home. Natalie noticed small changes in his tone, more decisive, less consultative. Conversations about shared decisions began sounding like briefings rather than discussions. Meanwhile, Natalie had resumed consulting part-time, working alongside Clara Mondays, a thoughtful colleague who admired Natalie's ability to balance motherhood with strategic thinking. Clara occasionally observed that Steve seemed more invested in optics than intimacy, but Natalie brushed it aside, attributing tension to career growth. She believed transitions required patience. The most subtle shift occurred not in dramatic arguments but in quiet evenings. Steve began referring to family time as something he fit in rather than prioritized. When Susie ran toward him with crayon drawings, he smiled warmly yet checked his phone seconds later. At dinners, he spoke about clients and market expansions, rarely asking Natalie about her own projects with the same depth he once had. The house still functioned smoothly, bills paid, routines intact, but the rhythm had changed. Natalie sensed distance but could not yet name it. She told herself ambition did not equal neglect. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of success, a new voice had entered Steve's life, a voice shaped by boardrooms and admiration. It was not cruel, not yet, but sharper. And Natalie, who loved order and stability, began feeling something unfamiliar, the quiet hum of imbalance that no spreadsheet could immediately solve. The first light did not arrive with thunder. It slipped in quietly, disguised as convenience. Steve told Natalie he needed to attend a last-minute overnight strategy session in Chicago with Morgan Vale and a potential investor. He delivered the information casually while adjusting his cufflinks in the bedroom mirror, his tone confident and reassuring. Natalie hesitated only briefly before nodding. She had grown accustomed to expanding calendars and urgent meetings. She even helped him pack, tucking in a neatly folded tie and a handwritten note wishing him success. That night, however, Clara Mondays mentioned in passing that the Chicago session had been rescheduled to the following week. The information landed softly but lingered heavily. Natalie chose not to confront Steve immediately. She reasoned there must be an explanation. Trust, she believed, required restraint. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Steve attended an exclusive business cocktail event, one he had decided not to describe accurately because he anticipated Natalie would question its purpose. That evening, Tamara Jonas attended the same event, representing a luxury branding client seeking consultancy partnerships. She wore confidence like a tailored garment, observing the room with practiced calculation. When Morgan introduced her briefly to Steve as a strategist with impeccable instincts, the introduction sparked immediate recognition, not of familiarity, but of ambition. The conversation began professionally, circling around market positioning and brand elevation, but quickly shifted into playful debate about influence and public perception. Tamara admired Steve's ease in commanding attention. Steve admired Tamara's unapologetic boldness. Neither crossed a visible boundary that night, but something unspoken aligned between them. It was the shared language of visibility, of wanting to be seen and validated by rooms that mattered. When Steve returned home late, he described the evening vaguely as productive and necessary networking. Natalie sensed details were missing but swallowed her unease, choosing faith over suspicion. The days following that event unfolded normally on the surface. Steve resumed affectionate gestures, bringing home flowers and playing with Susie in the living room. Natalie convinced herself that the flicker of doubt she felt was insecurity rather than intuition. Yet she began noticing small inconsistencies, receipts that did not align with stated locations, subtle shifts in tone when she asked about meetings, a guardedness around his phone that had not existed before. None of it was dramatic enough to demand confrontation. It was simply different. And sometimes, difference is louder than conflict. Natalie did not yet know Tamara's name beyond that fleeting introduction at the event. She did not know that the door had been opened not by betrayal itself, but by concealment. The first lie had not shattered anything. It had simply created a hairline crack, invisible to most, but capable of widening if pressure persisted. And pressure was building quietly, just beyond her line of sight. Natalie did not become suspicious overnight. She became observant. It began with patterns rather than proof. Steve's phone, once left casually on kitchen counters, now remained face down or tucked into his pocket. His business trips multiplied in frequency, yet stories about them felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. One evening, as he showered, his phone buzzed repeatedly on the nightstand. Natalie did not open it. She simply stared at the screen lighting up and fading, noticing the same unnamed number calling twice within minutes. She stepped away before temptation overruled her values. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, replaying conversations in her mind. She did not accuse, she analyzed. Natalie had always believed stability required awareness. So she began watching, not obsessively, not desperately, but quietly. She tracked credit card statements more carefully, noticing upscale restaurant charges in cities he claimed to pass through quickly. She compared travel dates with calendar entries. None of it confirmed betrayal, but none of it reassured her either. Meanwhile, life with Susie continued with innocent brightness. Susie, now energetic and expressive, adored drawing pictures of their family, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a large yellow sun. She had begun kindergarten and spoke proudly about her teacher, Mrs. Klein, and her new friend Oliver. Natalie volunteered occasionally at school events, wanting to remain grounded in something uncomplicated. During one parent-teacher evening, Steve cancelled at the last minute, citing a sudden client dinner. Natalie attended alone, smiling as she described Steve's busy schedule to other parents. Later that night, Susie asked why Daddy worked so much. Natalie answered gently, explaining that sometimes adults worked hard to build good futures. The answer felt incomplete even as she said it. At home, the house remained orderly, meals prepared, routines maintained. Yet Natalie sensed she was performing steadiness for Susie while internally gathering questions she did not yet dare ask. Janelle Brooks became the first person to hear Natalie's concerns. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Natalie spoke cautiously, describing inconsistencies without exaggeration. Janelle listened with protective intensity, urging her not to ignore intuition. "You don't need proof to feel something's off," she said firmly. Natalie resisted dramatic conclusions. She did not want to believe the man she married was capable of betrayal. Instead, she resolved to continue observing without confrontation, to collect clarity rather than assumptions. It was not passivity. It was strategy. In the privacy of her bedroom mirror one evening, Natalie studied her own reflection and whispered a promise to herself: if truth revealed itself, she would face it with courage. She did not yet know how heavy that courage would need to be. For now, she watched quietly, loving her daughter fiercely, holding her marriage together with careful hands, unaware that the quiet before a storm can sometimes be the most deceptive calm of all. Tamara Jonas did not believe in waiting passively for opportunity. She believed in creating it. Over the months following their initial professional encounters, her interactions with Steve had grown more frequent under the guise of collaborative consulting discussions. They met at high-end lounges, exclusive networking dinners, and strategy sessions that blurred the line between business and personal intrigue. Tamara observed the way Steve's posture shifted around her, more relaxed, more eager to impress. She understood the psychology of validation and fed it carefully, praising his insight, challenging his ideas just enough to stimulate competition. One evening, seated at a private rooftop bar overlooking the river, she leaned back thoughtfully and suggested he seemed exhausted from juggling too many expectations. "You need space," she said lightly. "Clear your head somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one expects anything from you." The idea landed precisely where she intended. Steve, flattered by her concern and drawn to the possibility of escape, entertained the thought with increasing seriousness. At home, Natalie was organizing a small family gathering to celebrate Marilyn Denver's birthday. She had prepared homemade dishes, arranged flowers, and planned a simple evening filled with warmth. Steve arrived late, citing work obligations, his energy restless and distracted. During dinner, while Marilyn recounted childhood stories and Susie performed an impromptu song she had learned at school, Steve's phone vibrated repeatedly on the table. He silenced it without explanation. Natalie noticed but did not comment. Later that night, when she gently asked if everything was all right at work, he assured her it was simply a demanding season. He mentioned the possibility of a short trip to reset and strategize, presenting it as a professional necessity. Natalie hesitated, suggesting perhaps they could plan something together as a family instead. Steve responded with measured patience, explaining that this trip would be brief and beneficial for everyone long term. His tone was persuasive, almost rehearsed. Natalie agreed, trusting the partnership she still believed in. Meanwhile, Tamara solidified the vacation plan with deliberate efficiency. She selected an upscale coastal resort known for privacy and exclusivity, framing it as a place where influential minds gathered discreetly. She emphasized how rare it was for someone of Steve's caliber to prioritize self-renewal. The narrative was carefully constructed. This was not indulgence. It was strategic restoration. Steve convinced himself the trip was harmless, a reward for relentless effort. He did not label it betrayal. He labeled it temporary escape. Yet beneath that justification lived a truth he avoided naming. He enjoyed being admired without obligation. The arrangements were finalized quietly, separate from Natalie's awareness of the full details. What began as a suggestion now had confirmation emails and departure times. The door that opened with a small line now widened subtly. And as the vacation approached, the distance between Steve's two worlds grew less theoretical and more real, though Natalie could not yet see how deeply that distance would soon cost her. It began with something small enough to dismiss. Susie came home from school one afternoon unusually tired, dropping her backpack by the door and asking if she could skip her usual playtime at the park. Natalie noticed faint bruises on her daughter's legs while helping her change into pajamas, bruises that Susie could not clearly explain. Children bruise easily, Natalie reminded herself. She applied gentle ointment and tucked her into bed, but unease lingered quietly. Over the next week, Susie complained of headaches and occasional dizziness. She, who normally hummed before sleep, grew quieter at night. Natalie scheduled an appointment with their pediatrician, Dr. Lawrence Kim, who conducted routine checks and suggested it might be a minor viral infection or simple fatigue. Steve, when informed, responded casually, reassuring Natalie that children often went through phases. He reminded her not to worry prematurely. His tone was calm, almost dismissive, encouraging patience over alarm. But the symptoms did not fade. During a weekend outing at the local playground, Susie stumbled while climbing a low step and seemed unusually weak afterward. Natalie's instincts sharpened immediately. She carried Susie home, heart pounding with maternal urgency she could not rationalize away. That evening, while Steve was preparing for his upcoming reset trip, Natalie described the incident in detail. He listened but remained composed, suggesting they monitor her condition a little longer before escalating concerns. He framed it as avoiding unnecessary panic. Natalie nodded outwardly, yet internally she felt a tightening anxiety. She stayed awake that night beside Susie's bed, watching her chest rise and fall in the dim light. Each small movement felt magnified. The quiet hum of household appliances sounded louder than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The following morning, Natalie insisted on further medical evaluation. She called the pediatric clinic again, requesting comprehensive blood work. This time, the nurse's tone shifted slightly at the mention of persistent bruising and fatigue. An appointment was scheduled for early the next day. As Natalie prepared Susie for bed, she forced steady reassurance into her voice, telling her daughter they were simply running superhero tests to make sure her body was strong. Susie smiled weakly and asked if Daddy would come to the appointment. Natalie hesitated, knowing Steve had final preparations for his trip, then assured her they would figure it out. Downstairs, Steve finalized travel confirmations on his laptop, mentally shifting into vacation mode. Upstairs, Natalie folded Susie's favorite blanket carefully at the foot of the bed. The house remained outwardly calm, yet something invisible had entered their lives, something neither could yet name, but which was quietly gathering momentum. The hospital corridor felt colder than Natalie expected, though it was early autumn and the air outside still carried warmth. She sat beside Susie in a pale blue waiting chair, holding her daughter's small hand as nurses moved in and out with gentle efficiency. The additional blood tests had prompted urgency. Dr. Lawrence Kim had recommended immediate referral to a pediatric hematologist. That was how Natalie met Dr. Priya Shah, a composed, focused woman with calm eyes that revealed both intelligence and gravity. Nurse Lillian Grant assisted quietly, explaining each procedure in reassuring tones, while hospital social worker Ria Collins introduced herself with professional empathy. Susie tried to remain brave, squeezing Natalie's fingers during needle pricks. Natalie maintained steady composure outwardly, but inside, her heart felt suspended in uncertainty. She had called Steve earlier, but his phone went unanswered. He had left for his reset trip that morning, promising to check in once settled. Natalie did not want to disturb him unless necessary. She still believed there would be a simple explanation. Dr. Shah returned later that afternoon with test results that altered the air in the room completely. She spoke carefully, explaining abnormalities in Susie's blood counts that required further immediate monitoring. The terminology was clinical yet sobering. Natalie's mind struggled to process each phrase: platelet levels, hemoglobin concerns, the possibility of acute complications. The doctor reassured her that early intervention improved outcomes, but there was no minimizing the seriousness of the findings. Additional tests were ordered, and Susie was admitted for observation. Natalie called Steve again, her voice steady but urgent, explaining that the doctors were concerned and that she needed him present. His response, brief and distracted, suggested he was boarding transportation and would call back later once settled. Natalie accepted it, though disappointment flickered across her face. In the hospital room that evening, fluorescent lights hummed faintly as machines beat rhythmically beside Susie's bed. As night deepened, Natalie remained awake in a reclining chair, watching over her daughter. Susie, pale but composed, asked if she could bring her favorite stuffed rabbit from home. Natalie promised she would retrieve it in the morning. She texted Steve detailed updates, attaching photos and summaries of what Dr. Shah had explained. The responses she received were delayed and short, framed as concern but lacking urgency. Ria Collins stopped by briefly, offering information about family support services and reminding Natalie she was not alone in navigating medical systems. Those words felt comforting but insufficient. The hospital, with its antiseptic scent and echoing footsteps, had become a world unto itself. Natalie realized something profound in that quiet room: life could pivot in a single conversation. She did not yet know how far this pivot would carry them, but she felt its weight pressing heavily against her chest. Outside, planes lifted into dark skies. Inside, a mother held vigil, unaware that the next chapter would demand more strength than she had ever imagined. The crash happened just after dawn. Natalie had barely slept when the steady rhythm of the monitors beside Susie's bed shifted into sharp, irregular beeping. Nurses moved quickly, their calm professionalism sharpening into urgency. Dr. Priya Shah entered with focused intensity, explaining that Susie's blood levels had dropped dangerously overnight. A transfusion was no longer a precaution. It was immediate necessity. Natalie felt the world tilt beneath her feet as medical staff adjusted equipment and spoke in concise, urgent phrases. Nurse Lillian squeezed her shoulder gently, assuring her they were acting quickly. Consent forms were placed in Natalie's trembling hands. She signed without hesitation. In the chaos, Natalie stepped into the hallway and dialed Steve's number again, her voice shaking as she left a message explaining that their daughter needed an immediate blood transfusion. She begged him to respond. She needed him present, not just financially, but physically. Hundreds of miles away, Steve was standing on the balcony of an oceanfront resort suite, sunlight reflecting off turquoise water. Tamara lounged inside, reviewing a luxury itinerary she had arranged for their stay. Steve's phone vibrated persistently in his hand. He glanced at the screen, seeing Natalie's name flash repeatedly. Irritation crossed his face before concern had a chance to register fully. He answered on the third call, stepping aside as Natalie's voice spilled through the speaker in broken urgency. She explained the transfusion, the risk, the fear. Steve's tone shifted sharply. He accused her of overreacting, of dramatizing medical situations. He insisted doctors often exaggerated to justify procedures. Natalie's voice cracked as she pleaded for him to come home immediately. The conversation escalated quickly, tension sharpening into hostility. Frustrated and unwilling to abandon his trip, Steve raised his voice, telling her he could not drop everything for another panic episode. Before Natalie could finish speaking, the call disconnected. Seconds later, when she tried to redial, her screen displayed a cold message, "Number blocked." Back in the hospital corridor, Natalie stared at her phone in disbelief, the sterile walls closing in around her. For a moment, she felt suspended between heartbreak and disbelief. There was no time to process betrayal. Susie needed her. She wiped her tears quickly and returned to the room where medical staff were preparing the transfusion. Machines hummed. Nurses adjusted tubing carefully. Dr. Shah explained each step with composed urgency, emphasizing that time was critical but controlled. Natalie took Susie's small hand and whispered reassurance, promising she was not alone. Outside the room, other families moved quietly through corridors, unaware that one father had chosen distance over duty. At the resort, laughter echoed faintly from a nearby pool as Steve silenced his phone completely. At the hospital, Natalie leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against Susie's hand. In that sterile, humming room, a fracture formed, not just in a marriage, but in the very idea of who Steve Stoner Cage was willing to be when it mattered most. The hospital moved with disciplined urgency, but blood availability remained uncertain in the critical window following Susie's collapse. Dr. Priya Shah explained that while emergency reserves existed, a compatible direct donor would accelerate stabilization and reduce risk. Natalie felt powerless listening to medical terminology she barely processed. Nurse Lillian stepped out to coordinate with the hospital's donor registry system, which maintained records of volunteers willing to be contacted during urgent cases. Minutes stretched painfully. Machines continued their steady beeping, and Susie lay pale but responsive, her small fingers weakly curling around Natalie's hand. Then, unexpectedly, the door opened and Dr. Shah returned with measured relief. A donor match had been identified. Someone already in the building for a routine appointment who happened to share Susie's rare blood type. His name was Marcus Thornfield. He had agreed immediately, without hesitation, after being informed of the emergency. He did not ask for background details. He simply consented. Marcus Thornfield did not enter with drama or recognition. He arrived quietly, dressed in simple dark clothing, his demeanor calm and steady. He was an architect specializing in pediatric hospital environments, meeting administrators that morning regarding design consultations. When informed of the urgent need, he responded with practical clarity. Years earlier, he had lost his younger sister due to delayed access to emergency medical support. Since then, he had registered as a regular donor, believing that if he could prevent even one family from facing similar loss, he should. He did not know Natalie. He did not know Steve. There was no hidden connection, no entangled history. When he briefly stepped into the donation room adjacent to Susie's, he offered Natalie a reassuring nod but did not intrude. "She'll be all right," he said simply, not as a promise, but as calm encouragement. His presence felt grounded rather than heroic. He acted because it was needed, not because it was noticed. The transfusion began shortly after. Dr. Shah monitored vitals closely while Nurse Lillian adjusted equipment with practiced precision. Natalie remained beside Susie, whispering stories about future playground visits and bedtime songs. Gradually, the monitors stabilized. Color returned faintly to Susie's cheeks. Relief spread slowly through the room, cautious but real. Marcus completed his donation and left quietly after a brief confirmation that Susie was responding well. He declined public gratitude, asking only that hospital staff continue improving pediatric care environments, a cause close to his heart. Natalie caught his name again as he exited, committing it to memory without fully understanding why. She did not chase him down the hallway. She returned to her daughter's bedside, overwhelmed by exhaustion and gratitude. Marcus Thornfield had entered their lives not through romance or intrigue, but through quiet action. He walked out of the hospital unnoticed by most, yet something about his steadiness lingered, an unassuming presence that would not disappear as easily as he had arrived. Susie's condition stabilized over the next 48 hours, but Natalie's mind did not. Exhaustion blurred her edges, yet clarity sharpened in other ways. While Susie slept, Natalie opened her laptop in the dim hospital room and began reviewing shared financial accounts with focused determination. She was not searching blindly. She was following instinct. Charges from coastal resorts, private dining experiences, luxury transportation services, all to be stamped during the very days Steve claimed his strategic obligations. The amounts were not subtle. They were deliberate. Her hands trembled as she cross-referenced travel confirmations with calendar entries and hotel names. What had once felt like small inconsistencies now aligned into a coherent pattern of concealment. Janelle Brooks arrived with coffee and fierce loyalty, sitting beside Natalie as the receipts stacked digitally before them. "This isn't stress," Janelle said quietly. "This is deception." Natalie didn't cry. She studied. She understood that emotion would come later. Right now, she needed facts. Hospital social worker Ria Collins entered later that afternoon with paperwork regarding insurance processing and emergency billing authorization. As Natalie signed documents, she noticed something peculiar. Steve had not responded to multiple hospital attempts to contact him regarding financial verification. His phone was listed as unreachable. Natalie felt humiliation mixed with anger. It wasn't just absence, it was avoidance. Ria, perceptive and professional, gently asked if Natalie had independent access to financial authority should urgent decisions be required. That question shifted something internal. Natalie realized she had trusted too fully in shared responsibility without maintaining protective boundaries. That evening, she called attorney Miles Kerr, a discreet family law specialist recommended years ago by Marilyn Denver just in case. She did not announce divorce or confrontation. She simply asked questions about rights, medical custody, and financial transparency. Miles listened carefully, asking measured follow-ups. He advised documentation over emotion. "Protect your child first," he said calmly. "Everything else follows." Meanwhile, far from hospital corridors, Steve's vacation continued under a strained illusion. Tamara noticed his distraction increasing. He checked his phone more frequently despite having blocked Natalie's number. News notifications and voicemails from unknown hospital extensions appeared, which he ignored with growing discomfort. Tamara sensed instability, not yet understanding its full cause. When she asked directly what was wrong, Steve minimized the situation, claiming Natalie exaggerated minor health concerns. Tamara studied him carefully. She had built her life on reading subtle shifts in behavior, and this was more than stress. Back at the hospital, Natalie closed her laptop slowly, receipts saved and forwarded securely. Susie stirred gently in her sleep, and Natalie brushed her hand across her daughter's hair. Something irreversible had occurred, not only in medical emergency but in moral clarity. The blocked call was no longer an isolated moment, it was evidence. And Natalie, who once avoided confrontation, was beginning to move not from hurt, but from resolve. Tamara Jonas had built her identity on control, and control depended on clarity. By the fourth day of the coastal retreat, she sensed something shifting beneath Steve's polished composure. He was present physically but distracted emotionally, checking notifications he claimed were irrelevant and stepping away to take calls he insisted were minor. Tamara had tolerated ambition and ego before. She even admired it. What she did not tolerate was dishonesty directed at her. One evening, seated across from him at a candlelit restaurant overlooking the ocean, she placed her wine glass down deliberately and asked him to tell her the truth about what was happening back home. Steve's answer was evasive, vague references to overreaction and hospital drama. The word hospital struck sharply. Tamara's expression hardened. She was many things, strategic, competitive, but she was not indifferent to moral boundaries. The absence of urgency in his voice unsettled her more than the situation itself. Back in the suite, tension thickened. Tamara pressed further, demanding specifics. Steve reluctantly admitted that Susie had required a medical procedure, but insisted it had been exaggerated. Tamara stared at him in silence, calculating the emotional distance between his tone and the gravity implied. She had no loyalty to Natalie, but she had expectations of integrity within her own involvement. "You blocked her?" she asked, incredulous when he confessed in frustration that he had cut communication to avoid being pulled back into unnecessary chaos. The word unnecessary lingered in the air. Tamara realized then that Steve's appetite for admiration extended beyond professional spaces. He craved it without accountability. The illusion she had constructed, of aligning with a powerful, decisive man, fractured slightly. She saw not dominance but avoidance. It was subtle, but it was real. The following morning, Tamara cancelled a scheduled yacht excursion without explanation. She sat alone on the balcony, considering the pattern unfolding before her. She remembered her father's disappearance years ago, the quiet abandonment that shaped her distrust. She had sworn never to entangle herself with someone capable of emotional cowardice. Yet here she was, witnessing behavior she could not rationalize away. When Steve attempted to resume normalcy, suggesting they ignore temporary distractions, Tamara's smile did not return. She understood ambition. She understood complex marriages. What she did not understand, or accept, was abandoning responsibility during crisis. For the first time since their involvement began, Tamara felt less certain she was winning anything at all. The vacation no longer felt strategic. It felt revealing. And what it revealed about Steve unsettled her more than any confrontation could have. Steve returned home earlier than planned, not because guilt had overwhelmed him, but because pressure had begun tightening around him from multiple directions. His firm had received discreet inquiries regarding his sudden unavailability during an active client window. Tamara's withdrawal of enthusiasm had unsettled him, and the hospital had left formal messages he could no longer ignore. When he stepped into the house, suitcase in hand, the silence greeted him differently. Susie was still admitted for observation, and Natalie was not home. The emptiness felt colder than any confrontation. Later that afternoon, he arrived at the hospital expecting tension, but what he encountered was composure. Natalie stood beside Susie's bed, steady and calm. She did not raise her voice. She simply informed him that she had secured temporary sole medical decision authority due to his unreachability during emergency intervention. Attorney Miles Kerr had filed precautionary documentation that morning. Steve blinked, stunned by the quiet precision of her action. The legal proceedings that followed were not dramatic courtroom spectacles, but structured administrative steps, hearings focused on custody protection and financial transparency. Miles Kerr presented documented call logs, blocked communication evidence, and travel receipts that aligned uncomfortably with the timeline of Susie's crisis. The judge overseeing preliminary matters listened carefully, emphasizing that parental responsibility during medical emergencies carried weight. Steve attempted to frame the situation as miscommunication and exaggerated panic, but the documented block on Natalie's number weakened his defense. Ethan Stonecage attended one of the hearings quietly, seated behind Steve, observing without interruption. Afterward, in a rare private conversation, Ethan spoke plainly. "You can't perform fatherhood," he said. "It either shows up or it doesn't." Steve bristled but had no immediate response. For the first time, applause offered no protection. Meanwhile, Natalie focused on Susie's recovery milestones, refusing to let legal conflict overshadow maternal presence. She coordinated with Dr. Priyashar regarding follow-up care and arranged home adjustments for when discharge would occur. Hospital social worker Ria Collins assisted with structured support planning, ensuring Natalie had access to counseling resources should she need them. Through it all, Natalie did not posture as vindictive. She moved with deliberate intention, understanding that stability required action, not argument. Steve watched from a distance as decisions unfolded without his central influence. The courtroom had no cheering audience, no corporate prestige, only accountability. And in that quiet legal space, something fundamental shifted. Natalie was no longer reacting to betrayal. She was restructuring her life with clarity. The marriage, once anchored by shared promises, now stood suspended by documented consequences. And for the first time, Steve began to feel the absence of control where he once assumed it permanent. Natalie did not file for divorce in a moment of rage. She filed in a moment of clarity. The paperwork was prepared carefully by attorney Miles Kerr, structured around documented abandonment during medical emergency, financial concealment, and repeated failure to prioritize parental responsibility. When she signed the documents, her hands did not tremble. She had cried already, in hospital corridors, in quiet showers, in the solitude of late nights, but now her tears had turned into resolve. Steve received the formal notice in his office, surrounded by framed certificates and polished surfaces that once symbolized achievement. He stared at the words in disbelief, convinced that Natalie would eventually soften. Instead, she remained consistent. In mediation sessions, she spoke calmly about boundaries, about stability for Susie, about the difference between financial provision and emotional presence. The judge overseeing proceedings noted her composure and the documented timeline of events. Divorce was granted with structured custody terms and clear financial responsibilities. There was no spectacle, only consequence. During this period, Marcus Thornfield reappeared not as a dramatic rescuer, but as a steady presence. He had returned to the hospital weeks after the transfusion to check on Susie's progress through Dr. Shah, who mentioned that the little girl he had donated blood for was recovering well. He did not intrude. He simply asked if she needed additional pediatric design adjustments in the recovery wing. When Natalie encountered him again in the corridor, she thanked him sincerely, their conversation brief but genuine. Over time, small interactions became slightly longer. Marcus would ask about Susie's energy levels. Natalie would inquire about his architectural projects, learning about his dedication to designing hospital spaces that felt less frightening for children. He spoke of his younger sister with quiet honesty, explaining how losing her shaped his mission. There was no flirtation, no urgency, only mutual respect grounded in shared experience of vulnerability. As months passed, Susie regained strength steadily, her laughter returning in bursts that felt miraculous. Marcus occasionally joined Natalie and Susie for simple outings, museum visits, park walks, quiet cafe afternoons. He never overstepped, never inserted himself where uninvited. He respected boundaries with deliberate care. Natalie found comfort in his steadiness, in the absence of performance. Conversations deepened gradually, moving from practical updates to personal reflections. One evening, walking along a river path while Susie rode her scooter ahead, Marcus asked if she felt ready for companionship beyond crisis. Natalie paused thoughtfully before answering. "I feel ready for honesty," she said. That was where it began, not with spectacle, but with sincerity. They started dating slowly, intentionally, without announcement or revenge. It was not about replacing Steve. It was about choosing presence over applause. And for the first time in a long while, Natalie felt something unfamiliar yet grounding, peace that did not require performance to sustain it. Steve did not lose everything overnight, but the erosion began quietly and professionally. Word traveled discreetly within his firm that he had been unreachable during a documented family emergency while on an undisclosed personal retreat. Morgan Vale, once impressed by his polished composure, began viewing him through a different lens. Clients valued reliability, and reliability required presence. Internal reviews scrutinized his recent decisions more closely. While no dramatic scandal erupted, subtle shifts in perception accumulated. Promotions stalled. Invitations to lead high-visibility projects decreased. Reputation, Steve discovered, could not be sustained on charisma alone. Meanwhile, Tamara Jonas distanced herself deliberately, unwilling to anchor her future to instability. Their association dissolved not in explosive confrontation, but in calculated withdrawal. Tamara returned her focus to independent ambitions, concluding that involvement with someone who fled responsibility was a liability she refused to absorb. Natalie, in contrast, experienced growth rooted not in revenge but in structure. She resumed consulting work gradually, collaborating again with Clara Mondes on community planning initiatives that balanced development with long-term sustainability. Susie's follow-up appointments with Dr. Priyashai reflected steady improvement, and Nurse Lillian often remarked on the child's resilience. Hospital social worker Ria Collins remained a resource, ensuring Natalie had access to educational support tailored to Susie's recovery needs. Marcus Thornfield continued integrating naturally into their routine, not as replacement authority but as consistent presence. He attended pediatric design forums during the week and spent quiet weekends sketching renovation concepts at Natalie's kitchen table while Susie colored beside him. The house, once shadowed by tension, began regaining warmth. Stability returned not because pain disappeared, but because accountability had been enforced and healing prioritized. Steve, now living in a sleek apartment overlooking the city, confronted a silence unfamiliar to him. Applause had grown intermittent. Social invitations became selective. Ethan visited occasionally, speaking honestly about responsibility and growth, though Steve struggled to reconcile ego with consequence. Alone in evenings once filled with validation, he replayed the hospital phone call in his mind more often than he admitted. The blocked number had not merely severed communication, it had severed identity. Meanwhile, Natalie tucked Susie into bed each night without anxiety tightening her chest. She understood that karma rarely arrived with spectacle. It moved through documentation, through decisions, through the steady accumulation of cause and effect. The life she rebuilt was not flashy, but it was grounded. And grounding, she had learned, was stronger than applause ever could be. The first morning Natalie woke up without dread felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Susie sat at the table, carefully pouring cereal without spilling, humming the same tune she used to sing before everything changed. That small sound felt like victory. Natalie packed Susie's school lunch with steady hands, no longer checking her phone compulsively, no longer bracing for disappointment. Her life had not become easier in a fairy tale sense, but it had become honest. The home was quiet now, yet fuller in ways she hadn't known were missing before. She had learned that stability was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of reliability. Each day followed a rhythm built on intention: school runs, work calls, dinner conversations, bedtime stories. The chaos had passed, leaving behind clarity. Natalie no longer measured her worth by how much she endured for others. She measured it by how well she protected what mattered most. Marcus Thornfield did not announce his place in their lives. He earned it gradually. He helped Susie with small architectural sketchbooks, encouraging her to draw buildings that felt safe and happy. He joined Natalie for quiet evenings where conversation flowed without defensiveness or performance. When challenges arose, he did not disappear or dominate. He stayed present. Their relationship unfolded with maturity, shaped by mutual respect rather than urgency. Natalie found herself laughing more freely, trusting more consciously. She was not rebuilding herself for anyone else, She was simply living aligned with her values. Marcus admired her strength, but never needed to compete with it. He understood that love was not rescue or spectacle. It was consistency. Together, they did not erase the past. They acknowledged it, learned from it, and chose differently. That choice became their foundation. Steve watched these changes from a distance, understanding too late what he had lost. There was no dramatic plea, no reconciliation arc, there was only accountability. He learned that moments define character more than ambition ever could. Natalie did not carry bitterness toward him. She carried lessons. Susie grew stronger, healthier, brighter, surrounded by presence rather than promises. And in that truth lay the story's lesson: love is action, not declaration. Responsibility is revealed under pressure, and when applause fades, character remains. Natalie Denver began again, not loudly, not vengefully, but honestly. Her new beginning was not about replacing what was broken. It was about building what should have existed all along. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.